Okay, so we're going to give you 6 conflicts.
There's way more than 6, but 6 is a good place to start.
Yeah.
Because that's enough.
Yep.
So when we're talking about different kinds of conflict, I think, automatically think of person versus person.
Right.
Tina, I'm mad at you. Stop doing that thing that you do.
Yep. When you're fighting with somebody. Person versus person. Yep. Or there's another one that seems to be in most books, and this is the third layer of conflict. It's the person versus self. Right? Like, why am I so, if only I had, maybe I shouldn't, I'm not good enough anyway. It's all that internal conflict, right? That's another layer. What's another one?
I love person versus nature.
Oh, tell me more.
Someone surviving in the woods after their plane crashed, or, how do we save our cities now that we've wrecked all the trees and, everything's flooding and floods, fire, and chaos because we've screwed it all up. I don't know. I even think would like a logging conflict, would that be person versus nature?
Only if the trees were attacking. I was thinking about Sharknado. Have you ever seen Sharknado? Oh, anyway, that's a ridiculous version of person versus nature, because the sharks are coming.
Like Jaws.
Like Jaws. Person versus nature. Yep.
So I'm sure there's a totally non-ridiculous.
There is. Well, Wild. Was it called Wild? What was
the Wild?
Into the Wild. The one about the boy.
I think that's more person versus self.
Except that it was nature that killed him.
Right.
Because he was
what
starving.
drove him there was person versus self, person versus society. Actually, that was a classic person versus society. Totally. I'm going to reject everything and just go live by myself.
And what makes the story so interesting to visually interesting to watch, or page turning to read, to me though, is the person versus nature. So he wasn't actually against nature, but he was alone out in nature and had to survive with what nature had for him, against or with the elements. And so the setting became an element of conflict that moved the story forward just by what was happening around him. So I would count that as conflict. It's a different use of it. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily like the core conflict that drives the story forward, but there's conflict in the setting itself.
Right. So it was like that person versus nature came to a head when he's like, oh, there's nothing to eat. I don't know how to feed myself around here.
That's right.
That's when the person versus nature kicks in.
Oh, there's so much here. Okay, and then we have, person versus technology. Do you remember? Terminator. Yep. You know what comes to mind is come on. Space Odyssey. I'm not that. I'm a different geek. But you remember when the machine starts talking to them? You don't remember? Okay, mm-hmm. War games. How about war games? I'm too old. Person versus technology is when like Terminator, technology turns on you.
Should we do a Jeopardy on this?
I will lose. I will so lose. I'm that person who loses nouns and names, so I wouldn't get it right. You know what? Okay, person versus technology. Frankly, we do this every day when we forget our frickin' passwords.
Programming for dummies.
No, just forgetting. Yes. When we forget our passwords.
Yes, that's true.
That's person versus technology. And we're like, this should be easier than this. Why is this so hard? That's an example of person versus technology. And of course, in Terminator, it's that your protagonist is going for something, but it's technology that stops him from getting it. Okay, so what's the other one? Technology? Oh, God, fate. That's a good one.
Well, basically, a lot of the Greek myths, right? It's like, ooh, I know this thing is going to happen to me. Butterfly effect, isn't that one? Have you ever seen that movie?
I haven't seen the movie. No.
So it's like, I know this bad thing is going to happen, but what if I could just go back in time and stop that?
Yeah, any time travel story is a bit of that, hey? Where the protagonist is trying to take the alpha position with God or fate, but God or fate, actually has the upper hand, and they're always up against that. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, you know, I think anything with prayer involved, really.
Yeah?
Right? It's like, I am calling on this higher power to change the situation.
So is that versus it then? No, not really. Not.
Well, I don't know. Isn't there an assumption that if you're praying like, God, don't let this happen, that God like made this happen in the first place?
Right.
So, I don't know. I'm not really into religion.
Well, I think but that's a great example of how conflict can also live in that. Like what I'm loving about this video that we're doing is there are obvious conflict lines, like where it is, you know, protagonist, antagonist, but then there's non-obvious ones like the setting, or like what you're saying, that even by going for something, there's an implied conflict underneath. So even prayer is a plot, a way to move the plot forward because you're praying for something because something isn't happening.
Right. So I'm just going to relate this really in a nitty-gritty kind of way to a writing process. Of course, all of our process is different. All of our books are different. So let's just say I am writing a memoir.
Okay.
How do I make use of this?
How to make use of conflict?
Well, just, you know, we know these 6 conflicts now as an example. You know, I sort of think about, like, as I'm writing, am I looking for those conflicts to arise, or how do I make use of this knowledge that we've just sort of thrown at everyone?
I think we have another video coming up where I get to load the decks. So I'm not going to do that here. But I will say that I think where we get to use conflict is we get to, it's kind of like when you're baking or when you're cooking and you know you need more salt, right? Or you know you need more basil or something. Whatever you get to play with how much more tension you want and how little tension you want. So it's like, is your book in a roller coaster setting, is this a downhill moment or is this an uphill moment? And if you're trying to create a really rock and uphill moment, like a pinnacle moment, then you want to stack that moment with as much conflict around as possible, obvious and inobvious, to get to the top.
And I think, you know, pointing to all these different conflicts and the way we've been talking about them, it also shows that it's around all the time.
We're totally right.
We can always access it. So instead of saying like, oh, conflict, it's bad, again, in the spirit of embracing conflict, start to notice where conflict lives in the story. And that just gives you more to work with and drive your story forward.
I love that. The word that comes to mind is, so like there's, like words that comes to mind is friction too. Like another way that conflict lives is friction. Like sometimes there's like explosion conflict, like, and then other times it's just like this. It's like, yeah, I like that. Get to notice where conflict lives. Yeah, in your story. Cool. Okay, so these were 6 the usual suspects of conflict, but there's all kinds of conflict. And what we said, you might like, yeah, that's not me. I've got like person versus the ocean, which you might say nature, but it feels better to say ocean for you, or person versus oxygen. I can't breathe, you know, whatever it is for you. Just notice when you're trying to get something and something's in the way of having it.
Right. I mean, you said person versus ocean, and that just brought up the Titanic. Like, you look up that story, it has like every kind of conflict.
Oh my gosh, it totally does. Yep.
So
yeah.
I think
technology, self, nature, God, society. Yeah. Yeah. Each other. All right, there you go. Keep going.
I hope you had as much fun as we did.
I know, we're having a really good time.